Hi folks, I just thought I'd do a short video on sewing the spikes for the dinosaur because they're very straightforward, but there's just a couple of things that will make life easier for you. And to do that in a way that you can see, I've actually cut out a spike from my main dinosaur fabric because it's not fluffy on the inside. You know, my sock fabric has lots of fluffy bits, which makes it quite hard for you to see what I'm doing. But I just thought you might see it more clearly on this. And I'm also doing it on the largest spike, so you can see pretty clearly that this end is the opening because it has these little extra sides on the large spike that we don't have on the others. So it should be clearer for demo purposes. And I have pinned my sock fabric right sides together. I did that when I was cutting it out actually, so they're perfectly lined up. And there were a couple of things I was saying in class, but would have been quite hard to see, I think, between the quality of the camera and the fact that I was doing it on a fluffy sock. And this applies to all of the spikes, right down to the smallest ones. And the first thing is, when you're starting to sew, don't go straight up from the edge that you're leaving the opening at. Start a few stitches in from there. Excuse me, I've got my double thread again. And I'm taking as small a stitch as I possibly can and leaving a sort of scant 1/8 of an inch along the edges. And I'm also working in a contrasting thread, so I hope you can see my stitches a little more clearly. But you can see clearly where I started there, and I'm going to finish in a similar spot. So I'm leaving about 3/4 of an inch to an inch of opening for turning the thing right around. And that little extra bit at the sides just sort of establishes an edge for sewing up the opening when you've eventually stuffed the spike. So I'll just keep going. Hopefully my little camera phone will do a sufficient job on this. If I get fancy, I might speed up this section so you're not watching somebody doing running stitch in real time. But they are, as you can see, quite small stitches. And you want to get a balance between them being nice and tight, but not puckered. And every now and again, just throw in a back stitch so that, you know, if something did get caught in the thread later on, it wouldn't pucker the whole of the spike. There's kind of little independent units that are closed by a back stitch. Maybe I'm being overcautious, but I just, you know, if it caught on a rough surface or whatever, when somebody's playing with it, you don't really want the whole thing to pucker up. And also I find with the double thread, you sometimes have to realign your threads when you're pulling through. It's just, they get a tiny bit out of sync. Of course, for spite, it's not happening now, but if it happens while I'm videoing, I'll draw your attention to what I mean. And whatever size of stitch I'm doing here, I think it's roughly the size of a machine stitch, maybe a tiny bit bigger. It seems to be enough for the stuffing not to come through or for the stitching to look very obvious on the finished object. So that's kind of all you're aiming for, really. You don't want gaps with stuffing falling out. And you don't want too visible stitching if you can avoid it. Sorry, just taking that pin out before it falls out. It's terribly flexible fabric compared to all the time we spend working with cotton, which, because it's woven rather than knitted, is much more structurally stable, if you like. So I did another back stitch kind of halfway down that side. I'm going to do one at the corner. Yeah, you could sort of see the way that the two threads were not quite in sync there, but a good pull will sort that out. And then I'm just going to stitch down this little extra side that the toll spikes have. But as I say, the technique's the same for all the different ones, whether they have spikes or no spikes. Again, just because I'm turning a corner, I'll do a back stitch. You don't always have to. And then in a little bit on the edge that will have the opening. Actually, using a tweezers to turn these things the right way out means that you don't have to leave a particularly big opening. Now, there's a great example of where the threads didn't come through evenly. So I've got one that I just need to pull a little bit to align it. Maybe my stitching thread is a bit long. I find when I'm trying to get through a bundle of these, I try to thread up as long as I possibly can to not to have to stop and thread again later on. But it doesn't always work entirely in your favour. So that is the stitching done, and I've fastened it off with a knot there. And now I'm just going to take my tweezers and pop it in through the opening and grab the point with the tweezers and pull it through. And then you're able to go in with your closed scissors or whatever it is, your bespoke poking tool. I find on these that you don't really get a defined side edge. You just kind of get a slightly rounder bottom corner on the triangle. So that is the opening that we've left. But because we have established on either side what a closed one looks like, when this is stretched over stuffing, it'll be comparatively easy to turn in those edges for closure. So we'll just get some stuffing. Oh, the other thing that I don't know, I mean, it's clear in the pattern, but she doesn't say it explicitly, but I think it's worth bearing in mind, is that it's good if all of your spikes have the knit of the fabric in the same direction, if you know what I mean. So if the knit on this is going up down, it's good if they're all in the same direction. It doesn't matter if they're left, right, or up, down, as long as they're all the same, because it affects how the object stretches, and you want them to be stretching in the same manner so that they can be fairly consistent. Now, saying that, it won't always be possible, because depending on the size of your sock and the way you place the pieces, you may have to make an accommodation where the stitch pattern goes in different directions. But in as far as you can, let's just say, I think it's preferable to to have them all going the one way. I think the one that I'm getting ready for Monday, it actually all goes across rather than down, because that was just the way I cut them out. But as I say, I don't have a preference for one over the other, but it is good if they all go in the one direction. So we'll say that is now filled to our liking, and we want to close up. So the fact that there's already a closed portion on that opening edge. Just makes it easier than if you were starting off in the corner. And in fact, you can use your needle to guide in the edges as you go along as well. So I'm just going to bring the knot up through the opening so it's buried on the inside. And then I'm going to tuck in my raw edges. And in this case, because this is actually going to be joined onto it'll be hidden because it's going to be joined onto the back of the dinosaur, I'm going to do an over stitch or a whip stitch rather than a ladder stitch, just because it's easier. I find ladder stitch very fiddly. And normally when I'm doing this, I bring it up closer to my eyes, but I can't video it if I do that, so you'll just have to watch me faff. And now I'm stitching it into myself, which is not to be recommended. If you tuck it in as you go along and then take the outer edges of what you've tucked, you'll find that you get a relatively neat and stable closure. I'm only really hitting my stride now. These might be a little bigger than I'd like, but again, it's to do with trying to keep them in the camera frame while not being quite able to see them as closely as I'd like. So yeah, just that little tucking in movement all the way along. And with all of these knitted pieces, again, because the fabric is much more flexible than we're used to, you'll find there's a bit of reshaping required when they're finished in each case. That's just molding them with your fingers to be the shape you want them to be, because like I'm putting extra pressure on the shape while I'm sewing this up, so it might be knocking it so that it's not quite as regular a triangle as it was meant to be. Just making a knot there at the end. And you can see the way that's bulging out there, but you know, I can mold that back into a regular shape, running the end through before I cut the thread, cutting it under a bit of tension so the end pops back in. And you can see there now, if we give it a little encouragement, it's a nice regular shape ready to be sewn onto the dinosaur.